Previously on Wentworth, Denise Tyler was brought to Wentworth and placed into isolation in secret. Vera headed down there to confront her and things got heated and Vera attacked Denise. Jake arrived and stopped Vera, but after Denise taunts Jake ends up losing it and tried to choke Denise to death. Joan Ferguson sent Vera a video telling her that she has nothing to do with Dr. Miller going missing. However, we learned that Joan actually does have Dr. Miller tied up in a derelict house where she is planning a deadly revenge plot against him and Mr. Jackson. We also learned that Joan is working at Sinclair using the fake name Karen Smith. Lizzie's son Artie arrived at Wentworth as a new trainee officer hoping to help the women at Wentworth. Lou Kelly spiked Boomer's homebrew with caustic soda, and she also discovered that Denise Tyler is being held in isolation, and she ended up telling all the women in the yard, causing everyone to go crazy. And Janet Latham murdered Zaina and framed Ruby after she left the bloody murder weapon in her cell. The prison is in lockdown and the minister is on the warpath. The women are all chanting from their separate units, "Baby killer, baby killer." Rita is in H1, furious at what is happening with Ruby. Janet walks past and Rita calls her over. "Miss Latham, what's happening with my sister?" Janet replies saying, "I don't know, Connors. The cops are talking to her now." Rita then says, "She didn't do it, Miss Latham." And Janet replies, "Well, what was the murder weapon doing in her cell then?" Janet then walks off and Rita bangs the bars with her hands and shouts out, "She didn't do it." We then cut to the interview room where Ruby is being questioned and Ruby is pleading with them, telling them that she didn't do it. The inspector says, "Well, why was the murder weapon found in your cell?" And Ruby says, "I don't know. Someone is setting me up. I was having a piss test for God's sake." The inspector says that she would have had plenty of time to carry out the murder and hide the weapon. And Ruby just repeatedly says, "I didn't do it. I loved Zaina. It was someone else." The inspector says, "I highly doubt that, Mitchell. Everyone was in the yard kicking off about Tyler at the time of the murder. The only person who can't be accounted for in that period is you." And Ruby has a very worried look on her face. Janet goes to see Lou in H6 and Lou looks up at Janet and says, "Well, you really are one of us in a uniform, aren't you?" Janet replies saying, "Yes, Kelly. Only difference between me and you lot is that I'm not stupid enough to get caught." Lou then does a sarcastic laugh and says, "So, when are you springing me from here?" And Janet stares at Lou with an evil smirk. Lou then says, "You better not double-cross me, Latham." And Janet says, "I don't know what you're talking about, Kelly. I think you might have banged your head on that little protest in the yard. If I were you, I'd go for a little nap. Otherwise, you could be heading to Sinclair despite Miss Westfall's report." Lou has an angry look on her face as Janet leaves Lou's unit. Lou then sits on her bed and pulls out Zaina's phone. She sends a message to her brother Travis with a file attached. Linda Miles is in the staff room having a sneaky drink by her locker. Artie comes in and makes some coffee and Linda quickly hides her drink and goes over to him asking if he's okay. And he then replies saying, "Yeah, he's fine. It's just that was the first time he's ever seen a dead body." Linda replies saying, "Oh, don't worry, you'll get used to it." And Artie's like, "What do you mean?" And Linda says, "This is Wentworth. Don't be surprised if you see a dead body at least once a month." And Artie lets off a nervous laugh. Linda then says, "Come on, I've got some admin work to train you up on." Ali's friend Sandy Edwards arrives at the gates of Wentworth wanting to visit Ali. The gate guard tells Sandy that all visits are cancelled today as all the women are in lockdown. Sandy asks what's happened and the gate guard says that he can't say. So Sandy just looks at the prison and then she starts to hear something in the distance. She starts hearing faint chanting coming from the women. She hears them chanting, "Baby killer, baby killer," and the penny drops and Sandy has a little bit of a surprised look on her face and leaves. Back in the interview room, and Ruby is crying. She didn't kill Zaina. Forensics then come into the room and tell the investigator that Ruby's fingerprints are the only ones on the knife. The investigator then charges Ruby with the murder of Zaina. Ruby screams and cries and gets taken away to segregation. In the governor's office is Will, Vera, and the minister. The minister is tearing strips off Will for this murder. Will tells the minister that he doesn't know how or why this happened, and Vera sticks up for him, adding that Zaina didn't have any enemies. She was really well liked, so this murder has taken us all by surprise. It makes no sense. The minister then says it's not only that, we now also have all the women baying for Denise Tyler's blood. How the hell did the women find out? Will and Vera look at each other, and Will then says apparently one of the women overheard some of the officers talking, and then the minister says which woman, and Vera says Louise Kelly. The minister then says, right, that's it, I've had enough. Take Kelly to the slot immediately. I've had enough of her. I'm gonna get her moved to Sinclair as soon as they have space. In fact, I'm gonna give him a ring right now. Vera then says, look sir, I know Kelly is a big troublemaker in this prison, but we can't send it to Sinclair until we've had Bridges' report. The minister says, I don't care. Take her to the slot now and I will start making some phone calls. The police investigator then knocks on the door and comes in with the news that they have charged Mitchell with the murder. The minister then says, good, that's another troublemaker I'm getting rid of. Mr. Jackson, get on the phone to allocations now. We are sending Mitchell to Blackmail immediately. Will then says, I don't think that's necessary, sir. I don't believe Mitchell would have done this. And then the minister says, if you question my orders just one more time, Mr. Jackson, I will be stripping you of your governorship and replacing you with immediate effect. I told you I wasn't tolerating any more trouble at Wentworth, and I meant it. Get Mitchell transferred now. Janet leaves the prison to go on her lunch break, and in the car park is Lou Kelly's brother, Travis. Travis says, Janet Latham, and Janet turns around and says, who wants to know? Travis then says, well, I've heard that you're not playing ball with my sister, Lou Kelly. Apparently you've decided to double cross her and not help her escape. Janet then tells Trav to fuck off and goes to walk off, but then Travis pulls out his phone and plays a voice recording. A voice recording that Lou has recorded of Janet telling Lou that she was going to kill Zaina in the shower block. Janet freezes with terror. She turns around and she goes to grab the phone, but Trav just pushes her over. He then says, do you think this is the only copy of this recording? My sister has a recording in that prison right now, and if you don't get her out of Wentworth by the end of today, she's going to the governor to play this recording, and you will end up behind bars when my sister will be waiting for you. Janet looks terrified, and Travis then says, if I were you, I'd skip your lunch and head back into the prison. Lou is waiting to see you. Back in H6, and Jake and a few officers come storming in and grab Lou and take her to the slot. Lou goes mad and smacks Jake in the face, while the officers hold her back. Lou is thrown into the slot and shouts out, fuck! Janet then heads to H6 where she is also looking for Lou, but she sees Linda and Artie, and Linda tells Janet that Kelly has been taken to the slot, and Janet then starts to panic because time is ticking. Back in H1, and Vera arrives to talk to Rita. Vera tells Rita that they will lift the lockdown, but she needs Rita to guarantee that the women won't do anything stupid about the Denise Tyler situation. Rita basically ignores everything that Vera has just said, and she asks Vera what's happening to my sister Ruby. And Vera says, I'm sorry Rita, Ruby has been charged with Zaina's murder. And Rita shouts out, no, she didn't do it, Miss Bennett. Why would she do it? She was going to be getting her parole. Vera then says, I'm sorry Rita, but the evidence is all against her. Now look, I want a guarantee that none of the women are going to cause trouble, otherwise I can't lift the lockdown. Rita then says, okay, I guarantee it. Just please lift this lockdown so I can then go out and find out who really killed Zaina. Vera then says, okay Rita, just as long as we have a deal. Janet quickly runs down to the slot and goes to see Lou. Janet says, what the fuck, Kelly? Lou then says, I take it you met my brother. Janet says that there's no way that she can get her out. Lou then says, I don't care how you get me out of here, but you have until tonight to bust me out. Otherwise, not only will I play that recording to the governor and the cops, but I will also make sure Connors gets a copy of this recording. What do you think Connors will do to you when she finds out that you set up her baby sister? And Janet says, watch it, Kelly. And Lou then stands up and says, no, you watch it, you fucking slag. You thought you could double cross me. Just ask anyone in this prison what I do to people who double cross me. You're lucky I don't rip your eyes out. Janet then says, please Kelly, I have a sister too, she's in Blackmail and I'm trying to protect her. I didn't want to kill anyone, but it was the only way I could get Mitchell sent to Blackmail. Lou then says, oh, I know, you don't want to do any of this, but you have no choice. Get me out of this prison by the end of today, otherwise you will be joining your sister behind bars. The lockdown is lifted and Rita runs out of H1 and heads straight down to H6 looking for Lou, but the women tell her that she's down this slot, and Rita is like, oh for fuck's sake, if I find out that Lou is behind this, I'm gonna rip that scar right off her face and I'm gonna ram it down her throat. Linda and Artie head down to segregation to get Ruby. The transfer van has arrived. Ruby starts to scream and cry as she's being dragged away by Linda and Artie, claiming she is innocent. As she's being dragged down to the loading bay, Ruby screams out for her sister, and Ruby is then put into the back of the van. The van then drives off and leaves Wentworth prison grounds, and as the van is halfway down the road, Sandy Edwards and a huge mass of protesters are walking towards the gates of Wentworth. Janet is storming down the corridor in anger, and Rita sees her and says, Miss Latham, I need to go and see Lou in the slot. And Janet shrugs Rita off and tells her to piss off, and Rita then shouts out, why won't anyone help me and my sister? Janet then turns around and walks up to Rita and says, your sister is on her way to Blackmail. Rita's like, what the fuck? And Janet says, she's gone, Connors, you're probably never gonna see her again, so get over it. Janet then walks off, and Rita then storms down to Jake and demands that he takes her to see the governor. Jake says that the governor is busy at the moment, but Rita says, I want to be transferred to Blackmail, and Jake says, don't be stupid, Connors. Rita says, please Mr. Stewart, I need to see Mr. Jackson or Miss Bennett. Jake takes Rita to Will's office, and Rita says to Will that she wants to be sent to Blackmail. Will says to Rita that I know you're upset about Ruby, but it was out of my hands. Rita says, I don't care, I want to be transferred to Blackmail. Will then says, Rita, you really don't want to go to that place. It's the highest security, trust me, you don't want to go there. Rita says, I have to, Mr. Jackson, I need to go and protect Ruby. The minister then bursts into the office and says that he has sorted a transfer van for Lou Kelly to be sent to St. Clair, and she can be sent immediately, so that's 2 troublemakers off your hands, Mr. Jackson. The minister then notices Rita and says, what's Connors doing here? Rita just looks at the minister, and Will says to Jake to take Connors back to H1, and Rita shouts out, but what about my request? The minister then says to Will, what are you waiting for? Get a team of officers down to take Kelly to that van. The phone then rings and Will answers, and on the other end it's Vera who's down at reception, telling Will that there is an army of protesters out in the car park. It looks like the mob have found out where Denise is. Will then says, okay Vera, I will order an immediate lockdown. Will then orders a lockdown and tells the minister what's happening, and the minister says, it's just one disaster after another, isn't it, Mr. Jackson? Will then says, once the women are all locked up, he will get a team of officers down to get Kelly. Boomer, Ali and Rita are taken back to H1 by Linda and Artie, and Boomer is like, why are we being locked down again, Miss Miles? And Linda says, it's out of our control, Jenkins, there's a mob of protesters just outside the prison, and we don't want any of you guys getting the same idea. Jake goes to Janet to let her know that Lou Kelly is being transferred to Sinclair and the van is waiting, and Janet says, what? Why? And Jake says, no idea, it's an order from the minister, are you coming to help me escort her? And Janet says, no, I can't, I need to be somewhere, and Janet then runs down the corridor. Jake then sees Linda and Artie and asks them to give him a hand with Lou. We then cut to the outside of the prison where Sandy and the protesters are hurling abuse at the gate guards and the prison, telling them to bring the baby killer out. Janet runs through reception and leaves the prison, and as she goes through the outer gate barrier, she tries to squeeze past the protesters, but the protesters grab Janet and tell her to bring out the baby killer. Janet tells them all to fuck off and to let her go, and Janet struggles through the swarm of angry protesters and eventually manages to get out of the car park. Sandy then tells the gate guard that they will get in, and when they do, they are going to rip Denise apart, and the angry mob cheer. Denise is sitting alone in isolation, listening to the angry mob baying for her blood through the window. Back in H1, and Boomer is telling Ali that she hopes this lockdown isn't going to last for days because she needs to check on her home brew. Ali tells Boomer not to worry, the longer she leaves it, the more stronger it will become. And Boomer is like, yeah, but I've got loads of orders I need to fulfill. Rita paces up and down H1 with a face of anger. Jake, Linda and Artie get to the slot and they open Lou's door. Lou turns to them and says, what the fuck do you lot want? Jake tells Lou that she's being sent to Sinclair. It's time to go, Kelly. Lou then runs at Jake and attacks him, saying, no, I'm not going there. Where the fuck is Miss Latham? And it takes all three officers to restrain Lou and drag her to the loading bay, where they literally have to throw Lou into the back of the van. While Lou is in the back of the van, she's kicking the crap out of the back door, literally going crazy. The van then drives off and it gets to the front gates where all the protesters are. The police have just arrived as backup and the gate guard tells all the protesters not to try anything, and the police barricade the protesters as best as they can. The gate guard then opens up the gates and the van starts to drive through slowly, passing all the protesters, and they start banging on the side of the van, and Lou inside the van is getting really annoyed and she's telling all the protesters to fuck off, you cunts. Just as the van crosses the gate, Sandy and some of the protesters push past the police and the gate guard, and they run through the gate and into the prison grounds. They run all the way up to the reception doors where Vera and a few officers are inside, and they lock the doors quickly, so Sandy and the protesters start banging on the doors, telling them to bring out the baby killer. Vera sounds the panic alarm and radios through to Will that we have a serious situation on our hands. All hell breaks loose and the protesters are determined to get into the prison. The police call for more backup as the protesters start throwing bricks and bottles at the prison building. Rita is still pacing up and down H1 until she has a bit of a light bulb moment. She tells Boomer to lay down on the floor and to pretend that she's in pain. And Boomer is like, what? Why? And Rita says, look, just do it, Booms. So Boomer gets on the floor and pretends to wriggle around in pain, and Rita then runs to the bars and calls for help. A few miles away, and the van that Lou is in is driving up a country lane. All of a sudden, a car drives up beside them and forces the van off the road and into a ditch. A masked woman comes out of the car with a gun and points it at the staff members in the van, telling them to get out, otherwise she's going to shoot them. The driver gets out slowly while the passenger presses a small panic button in the van. The masked woman orders the driver to open the back of the van and to let the prisoner out. So the driver opens up the door and Lou is like, "Whoa, what's going on?" The masked woman then orders the driver to stand back and let the prisoner come out. The woman then notices that the passenger has pressed a panic button in the van, and she then shoots the passenger in the stomach. The driver then goes to grab the gun, and the masked woman turns and shoots the driver in the head. The masked woman then takes off her mask, and of course it's Janet Latham. Lou is like, "What the fuck is going on?" And Janet then points the gun at Lou and says, "I've done what you wanted, you're free, but before I let you go, I want that phone." And Lou replies saying, "No way, I needed to contact Trav." So Janet says, "Okay, ring him right now, arrange a place to meet him, and then give me that fucking phone. Otherwise, I swear to God, Lou, I will kill you." Lou then picks up the phone and rings her brother, telling him that she's out of the prison and needs to meet him somewhere. Trav tells Lou that he is in a hideout, keeping his head down. Number 4, Regan Mills. Lou says, "Okay, I'll be there soon, little brother." Lou then hangs up and Janet tells Lou to give her the phone. Lou then says, "Only if you give me that gun." Janet says, "Don't be stupid, Kelly, I'm not giving you this gun." Lou then says, "Okay, well, you're gonna have to kill me. But just before you get ahead of yourself, my brother still has a copy of the recording. So if anything happens to me, you're going down, bitch, so it's up to you." Janet continues to point the gun at Lou and says, "Okay, I'll give you the gun if you give me the phone." Lou then says, "You give me the gun first, and I will then give you this phone." Janet starts to shake while pointing the gun at Lou, and Lou says, "You better hurry, Miss Latham, that cunt in there has pressed a panic button." Janet says, okay, and Janet then gives Lou the gun. Lou says, "Good girl." Lou then points the gun at Janet and tells her to get on her knees. And Janet's like, "What are you doing, Kelly? We just had a deal." And Lou says, "On your knees now, you ginger bitch." Janet then goes onto her knees and Lou tells her to beg for her life. And Janet says, "Please, Kelly, I've done what you've asked me to do." And Lou then says, "But you double-crossed me, Miss Latham." Janet then looks up at Lou, and Lou then kicks Janet in the face, knocking her clean out. Lou then drags Janet across the gravity ground and puts Janet in the boot of her own car. Lou then jumps in the car and drives off. Back at the prison, and the protesters are still going crazy trying to break into the reception area of the prison. Will says to Vera, "What can we do?" And Vera says, "Don't worry, we'll just have to leave it to the police now." Back in H1, and Rita is still calling out for help for Boomer, and Miss Miles arrives with Artie. Linda says, "What's wrong, Connors?" And Rita says, "Boomer has had a fall and she's in a lot of pain, we think it's the babies." And Linda is like, "Oh shit," and she unlocks the gate. And Linda and Artie run in. Linda bends down to check if Boomer is okay, and then Rita grabs Linda from behind and has her in a headlock. Artie says, "What are you doing, Connors?" And Rita orders him to stay back. Ali then says, "Rita, what are you doing?" And Rita says, "If they won't send me to Blackmail to be with Ruby, then we'll have to do it the hard way. Now get back, Mr. Birdsworth." Linda tries to reason with Rita while Rita's choking her. Rita then orders Artie to give her his radio and keys, otherwise she's going to hurt Miss Miles. Linda tells Artie not to do it, but then Rita grabs Linda's baton, pushes Linda up against the wall and smashes her in the face with the baton. And Linda goes to the ground. Rita then grabs Linda again, holding her from behind with the baton against her neck. Rita then says to Artie, "Give me your keys and your radio." Artie then takes off his radio and keys, and Rita tells him to throw them on the floor and to get into one of the cells. Rita then unhooks Linda's radio and keys and kicks them both out of the cell and into the corridor. Rita then throws Miss Miles into the cell with Artie and locks the door. Boomer then runs up to Rita and says, "What are you doing, Rita?" And Rita says, "It's okay, Booms, I got this. You guys just play dumb." Rita then hugs both Ali and Boomer and she leaves H1, locking the gate behind her. Linda and Artie are banging on the cell door and Ali and Boomer turn up the TV in the unit. Rita makes her way through the prison as most of the officers are down at reception keeping an eye on things. Rita makes her way down to isolation where Denise is held up. Rita pokes her head around the corner and sees that there is an officer guarding the unit. So Rita throws Linda's baton across the corridor to make some noise and the guarding officer comes to investigate. As he comes out of isolation, Rita smashes him from behind and knocks him out. Rita then goes into isolation and opens the door. Denise looks up and says, "Who the fuck are you?" And Rita replies, "I'm your worst fucking nightmare."